Hello, I'm Tassos Stassopoulos. Today's podcast will be slightly different. Our team is planning to head back to India later this year as part of our research on how consumers' mindsets and priorities have changed since the pandemic. We wanted to give you an insight into our initial brainstorming on possible topics which require in-depth investigation in the field. For this, I'm joined by Gita Ghate, the managing partner of ethnographic research firm Third Eye, that we will be working with on this study to get some initial thoughts on key consumer shifts in India and the ones we should be investigating in our study. Gita, welcome.
Thank you, Tassos, for having me.
The world has seen major events recently: COVID, the war in Ukraine, inflation and energy shocks. However, away from the headlines, our recent ethnographic study in Brazil found some fundamental changes with consumers, partially driven by the pandemic. What are you seeing on the ground in India?
So I think it's similar in India. I think the pandemic has been a huge, trigger for consumer change in India. I think we are seeing some very interesting shifts that are here to stay. So the consumer reacted for a long period of time and now has actually settled with some changes. And much like Brazil, the Ukraine war has not impacted India as much as it's impacted the rest of the world. Our inflation is still at 6%. And we're also buying cheaper oil from Russia. Our wheat exports are now beginning to stabilize a little bit. So I think it's the pandemic that's been the bigger behavior changer than the current geopolitical events.
So what are the changes from the pandemic that we should focus on for the Indian consumer?
So I think it's interesting. There are many changes, but I think one of the biggest changes that we're beginning to see in India's health, and I think we as a nation was much more health reactive than health proactive. So Indians would actually not look at preventative health, unlike the rest of the West. You didn't see Indians going for health checkups, investing in health or being conscious or about health or caring for one's health was not something that you saw in mass India. You may have seen it in a sliver of the upper end Indians, but mass India didn't. This is what COVID actually changed. Immunity became a big conversation. There were people who were actually having stuff that was either traditional immunity boosters or things like zinc and vitamin C. Supplements saw boost. We also saw insurance go up. Something that health insurance, something that Indians didn't believe in for a long period of time. And we're beginning to see that actually as something that will possibly stay for some time to come.
Is there a change in the fatalist mentality in the consumer's mindset?
Yes, I think that's what's begun to change. And I think it's a good point, Tassos, because I think we were very fatalistic and we have a saying that says Ram Bharose or as God willing. But I think that has begun to change because people have realized health is something that I think COVID made them realize that if they are careful, it's in their hands. And therefore, outcomes can be controlled if there is greater consciousness. And they're beginning to actually look at that now.
And what changes do you see in the lifestyle of the Indian consumer post-COVID?
That's a great question too, because I think while you're looking at health and they're actually looking at living healthier lifestyles, what you're also beginning to see in India is what I'd call the YOLO effect. I think the pandemic made them realize that you do live only once. And we as a culture have always either denied or deferred desires, wants, indulgence. And while like all other emerging economies, aspiration is a big conversation. I think the acceleration of aspiration is what COVID has actually done. So you see the Indian traveler really emerging. You see domestic travel actually is now really picking up, whether it's hotels, whether it's airlines. You begin to see lots of Indians who would have traditionally traveled to their families and their villages now actually traveling to places like Goa. Suddenly India is on local travel has become on the destination map for many Indians. And this is not Indians who traveled abroad. This is Indians who never traveled. So I think that is the interesting shift, because across the world, you are any case beginning to see international travelers traveling more locally because COVID didn't allow them to cross borders. But you didn't see local Indians who had not traveled at all suddenly beginning to travel. So there's the birth of the Indian traveler.
So the locking them in their homes created an acceleration of this trend.
Absolutely. And you'll begin to see that. So I think hotels, which probably didn't do well in COVID, and we all know that, airlines, you're beginning to see how all of those and their businesses will possibly see an upswing because of this trend.
That's really interesting. And one other trend that we've been looking at is actually the different speeds of trends between what we called India 1 and India 2 in the past. The India 1 of the big cities, very westward looking, and the India 2, which lives generally in second tier cities, and they're much more focused in their Indianness. Are we going to find any differences, any changes?
That's again a really good question, Tassos, because the Indian is a traveler, and that trend you're going to actually see much more in India too now. So the fact that suddenly India too is going to see this kind of pent-up demand for a more aspirational lifestyle, and while inflation will get them to readjust what they spend on, you'll begin to see that they are beginning to spend a little more on this. And that to me is the interesting part of it. Because the India one was always the traveler. India one was always the guys who spent. But the YOLO effect will be seen in India too more than it will be in India one. Is my prediction going forward.
Yes. And in the past, we always spend a lot of time visiting rural areas. Are we going to see the rise of an India 3 in the rural areas, which will start becoming meaningful to domestic consumption at this stage?
I think India 3 will rise. And I think when COVID hit India, there was a sudden rise because it took a long time for them to for COVID to move into the villages. So and you saw this whole reverse migration of people going back to the villages. Plus the government had several schemes for rural employment. So you saw the rise of the power of India 3. And while it's settled to some extent, what it's actually done is it's begun to trigger demand. And it's actually at some level helped to accelerate the emergence of India 3 again. So you will definitely see it as a consumption cohort going forward for sure.
So it's an important area for the companies to focus on.
Yes.
And we've been doing these studies now for over a decade together, and we have looked at a number of trends over the years. Is there something unusual that you're picking up that we should investigate further in the studies?
So I think it's a really interesting question. And, when we look at India and we look at emerging markets, we look at all kinds of consumption trends. But the one thing that we are beginning to look at, and of course it will shape consumption, is suddenly the crisis in relationships. So we're a collective culture. Relationships, whether it's with families or it's with couples, have been forever. So the first big shift you saw was 10 years ago, where collective joint families, we all lived in joint families, grandmothers, grandfathers, grandmothers, so maybe 3 generations. They broke and became nuclear units. So that was the first shift, and that changed consumption behavior in any case, because you needed smaller sizes, houses, everything. Now you're beginning to actually see a crisis in relationships between couples, and therefore what we are calling it a crisis of love. So one of the big things you're going to see is the question of how far you'll go for love. And what does that mean?
It sounds like a Meatloaf song.
It is.
Okay.
It is.
How far
I'm saying, how far would you go for love? So what you will see, again, it's very early trends, but you're beginning to see, and this is a India 1 phenomenon to begin with. It's skirting India 2. Probably takes some time, but it's definitely an India 1 phenomenon. You will see the impact of what I mean by how far will you go for love. The fact that you will need more and more to reassure each other, couples in relationships, that the relationship is solid and they're committed. So
and that will change the consumption patterns of a couple.
Yes, and of the family.
Okay.
So it's interesting. This is again something we're picking up a sliver of.
Okay.
It's an early, you can see it in the horizon, but you know that it's, like you said, if you don't look hard enough, you might miss it, but it's there.
So what type of things should we be looking at in this area?
I think experiences.
Don't take your family for granted. Make sure.
Yes, that they matter. Give them what they... Make it... So, for instance, you will see holidays. You will see shared spaces. You might even see jewelry, food and beverages. So you'll actually begin to see a lot of stuff that are about affection, affiliation, the fact of coming together. You'll begin to see a lot of that conversation.
Very fascinating. Gita, many thanks for joining us today. I'm very excited about this study in December, and it will be my 29th ethnographic study, and I never thought until now that I will be studying how far people will go for love in a study in emerging markets. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tassos, and good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to the series wherever you get your podcasts from. We also want to remind you that the views expressed in this podcast do not constitute research, investment advice or trade recommendations and do not necessarily represent the views of Trinitra Investment Management LLP and are subject to revision over time.